20,000 years ago, in a limestone shelter lit by a single trembling fire, a baby begins to scream in the dark. Not a whimper. A full, chest-deep wail that echoes off wet stone. Somewhere in that darkness, a hand reaches out before the mind has even finished waking up. Fingers find a small shape carved from hollow bone, worn smooth at one end a rattle, tucked beside the infant every night. Though no one alive could tell you why it was placed there first. The obvious question is simple. Did ancient parents know why their babies cried? But the more interesting question hides just beneath it. Did they need to know, in the way we mean knowing? Or had evolution already written the answer into their bodies before a single word for hunger or fear ever existed? Here's the partial answer, before we go further. They almost certainly could not explain a baby's cry the way a modern pediatrician can. But their bodies responded with a precision that modern science is only now able to measure. That gap between not knowing and somehow still knowing is where this story lives. Start with the sound itself. A newborn's cry isn't random noise. It's an acoustic signal shaped by millions of years of selection, tuned to a frequency range that the adult ear finds almost impossible to ignore. Evidence from developmental biology shows infant cries cluster around a pitch that overlaps uncomfortably with alarm calls in other primates. That's not an accident. It's a design constraint. A crying infant, for most of human history, was a body announcing a problem it could not solve alone. Too cold, too hungry, in pain, separated from a caregiver in a world genuinely full of things that could kill it. Natural selection didn't need ancient parents to understand the cry intellectually. It needed them to feel unbearable. And they did. Researchers studying stress physiology have found that an infant's cry triggers measurable spikes in a caregiver's heart rate and skin conductance, a body-level alarm. Not a thought. But here's the strange part. The response arrives faster than reasoning does. So if the reaction is built in, does that mean ancient parents were simply following instinct like a lock accepting a key? Not quite. That would be too clean, and human infancy has never been clean. Human babies are born strangely helpless compared to other primates unable to walk, barely able to hold up their own heads, utterly dependent for months where a young chimpanzee can already cling and climb. Some researchers have proposed this reflects an evolutionary trade-off, bigger brains meeting narrower pelvises, forcing birth to happen early, relative to physical readiness. That single trade-off changes everything about crying. A cry from a creature this fragile isn't just a signal. It's a countdown, which means ancient parents weren't decoding an occasional puzzle. They were living inside a near constant state of interpretation, dozens of times a day, with almost no room for error. Consider a specific, tangible example. Infant burials recovered from Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe, dated to roughly the last ice age. In several of these graves, archaeologists have found small perforated objects, shell beads, ivory pendants, and in rarer cases, items resembling rattles positioned near the infant's head or hands. We cannot know with certainty what these objects meant to the people who placed them there. That's speculation, and it should be labeled as such. But the pattern itself, deliberate, repeated, careful, is evidence. It tells us something was already understood, long before written language, that infants needed to be soothed, distracted, comforted, not merely fed and kept warm. Imagine the moment of placement. Not a museum case, not a diagram. A parent, kneeling in cold soil, tucking something smooth and rattling beside a body too small to have lived a single winter. That is not neutral behavior. That is a response to something. The first layer of evidence is anatomical. The human ear canal, even in infancy, is shaped to be maximally sensitive to frequencies in the cry range, a structural fact, not a cultural one. The second layer is behavioral. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies used cautiously, as analogs rather than time machines show caregivers responding to infant distress within seconds, almost universally, across radically different cultures and belief systems. That consistency across such different social worlds is itself a form of evidence. It suggests something older than culture is driving the response. The third layer is neurological. Brain imaging research on adult caregivers listening to infant cries shows rapid activation in regions associated with threat detection and reward seeking almost simultaneously. The brain isn't asking, "What does this mean?" It's already moving. That should not have happened if crying were just noise. But it makes complete sense if crying evolved as the single most urgent communication channel of a helpless infant's life. The fourth layer is comparative. Other altricial species animals born underdeveloped, like rats and some birds, show parallel distress call structures that trigger near automatic parental responses. This cross-species pattern strengthens the inference that we're looking at something ancient in the evolutionary sense, not merely ancient in the historical one. Layer by layer, a picture assembles itself. Evidence of anatomy, behavior across cultures, brain response, and even other species, all stacking toward one conclusion. Crying wasn't a mystery ancient parents had to solve from scratch. It was a conversation their bodies had been rehearsing since before they were born themselves. That's the intellectual reward hiding inside all this evidence. The real discovery was never the crying. It was the listening. Not everyone agrees on how much of this response is truly innate versus deeply learned in early childhood. And this is worth presenting honestly rather than resolving artificially. Some researchers argue that caregiver sensitivity to cries is substantially shaped by exposure, that people who spend more time around infants become faster and more accurate interpreters, suggesting a strong learned component. Others argue the baseline alarm response is present even in people with little infant experience, pointing to a stronger biological foundation. Both camps have supporting data. The honest answer at this point is probably both, in proportions we don't yet fully understand. That uncertainty isn't a weakness in the story, it's the story being told carefully. Everything so far has come from indirect evidence bones, objects, inference, stretched across tens of thousands of years without a single sentence of testimony. Then, remarkably, the silence breaks. Once written history begins, in societies from ancient Mesopotamia to early Greek and Roman texts, something changes. Parents start leaving behind actual words about crying children. Medical and domestic writings describe distinguishing a hungry cry from a cry of pain, offering remedies, describing swaddling techniques meant specifically to calm distress. This is the reveal buried in the shift itself. For the first time, we're no longer guessing what a gesture meant. We're reading what a person actually believed. And what they believed lines up, again and again, with the deeper instinct the bones could only hint at that crying carried meaning worth decoding, urgently, every single time. Here's where it gets almost eerie. Modern acoustic analysis spectrograms that break a cry down into pitch, rhythm, and intensity has found that adults, across cultures and even across species boundaries, can distinguish a pain cry from a hunger cry above chance levels, often without any training at all. In other words, a capability ancient parents almost certainly exercised without vocabulary for it, modern instruments can now put a number on. The instinct wasn't primitive guesswork. It was, in a very real sense, data processing just running on a nervous system instead of a spectrogram. But it would be a mistake to imagine every ancient parent as an identical, perfectly tuned instrument. That flattens real human variation into a myth. Think about how differently modern parents respond to a 3 a.m. cry. Some wake instantly, alert and calm. Others take longer, groggy, fumbling, imperfect. Exhaustion, illness, grief, and stress all blunt the response then as now. There is no reason to believe a mother in an ice age winter, malnourished and sleep-deprived after a hard season, responded with the same speed as one who was well-fed and rested. Treating ancient parents as one monolithic, ever-alert unit erases exactly the kind of human variability that the evidence actually suggests existed. Instinct sets a baseline. Circumstance writes the rest. One dimension almost never discussed. Siblings and the wider group, not just parents, likely played a major role in interpreting infant cries. In small, close-knit ancient communities, multiple caregivers, older children, grandparents, other mothers would have built up a kind of shared, distributed expertise in reading distress signals. A second overlooked dimension, nighttime itself. Darkness would have amplified urgency, since a crying infant in the dark, in a world with real predators, carried survival stakes that daytime crying simply didn't. The calculus of how fast must I respond was never constant. It shifted with the sun, and survival conditions reshaped everything. In many ancient and traditional societies, infants were carried almost constantly against the caregiver's body rather than placed at a distance. That single practical constraint, the physical impossibility of walking away, meant a cry was rarely a delayed message. It was often caught the instant it began, muffled against skin, felt as vibration before it was even fully heard. Constant contact wasn't tenderness alone. It was infrastructure, a survival strategy disguised as closeness. We still do this today. Skin-to-skin contact, now recommended in maternity wards worldwide specifically because it reduces infant distress and stabilizes heart rate, is not a modern invention. It's a rediscovery, wrapped in clinical language, of something ancient caregivers arrived at through necessity rather than research. The rattle by the fire and the monitor by the hospital crib are separated by 20,000 years and functionally chasing the same goal, which raises something larger than babies, larger than crying itself. The fact that this question, did they know, still grips us today, reveals something about what we actually want to believe about our ancestors. We want proof that care is old. That tenderness isn't a modern luxury layered on top of a brutal past, but something woven into us from the very beginning. Every rattle in every grave is really a vote for that idea. So, did ancient parents know why their babies cried? Not in the analytical, diagnostic sense we imagine when we use the word know, but their bodies already carried a version of that knowledge, refined over evolutionary time and sharpened further by lived experience, culture, and community, which meant that even without a single word for it, they usually responded as if they did. Return for a moment to that shelter. The fire is lower now. The crying has stopped. Somewhere in the dark, a hand still rests near a small bone rattle, not because anyone explained why it mattered, but because it simply did the way it still does, in a different shape, beside a different crib. Tonight, the larger truth was never really about babies at all. It was about the astonishing fact that care can travel across tens of thousands of years without ever needing to be taught from scratch each time, that some forms of love are less like discoveries and more like inheritances. The bones never cried, but somehow they still remembered who did.